So today, what I'm choosing more is actually, um, I guess I am not going to offer you recipes, advice necessarily on slide about what to eat, what to drink, what not to eat, what not to drink, how to be healthy and happy is definitely an important goal. And you have had many people come to you to speak about all of these things. Today's
Mhm.
approach is actually to maybe perk your curiosity, to give you the opportunity to actually think outside the box and actually, in so doing, empower you. That is my primary aim in my practice. That is how I practice medicine. I'm not interested in just disease management. I'm interested in empowering the patient to wellness. And the data I'm going to present here are going to be not so much charts of data, but concepts that are really key to understanding a few things. So at the end of this presentation, I hope you will have some awareness of what governs disease and health in the physical body, and particularly what are the real causative factors for why you would develop a physical condition. Um, how emotions are an integral, often overlooked part of why we get sick, and how they can begin to help, how you can begin to help yourself, in addition to the medications and diets and lifestyle management that you have already started to put in place. These, you know, I hope that today's lecture will give you some understanding of maybe how the human body works and what I can do for myself in addition to what my doctor and other healthcare practitioners do for me. So it's really, I'm going to try and keep it down to about 30 minutes so we have time for questions, and we'll go from there. So I guess these are big questions. I don't expect to cover everything to do with what is disease, how is it caused, and how is it treated. But I started with this bullet point just to set the background for the kind of questions that I have asked as I have practiced integrative medicine, because the standard medical approach has to be reviewed so that you understand the various aspects of how and where your doctor is coming from. So you can maybe then start to ask what are the kind of questions who people who practice in the space that I do ask. So, for instance, if you look at the actual epistemology, which is basically a fancy word of saying what are the actual methods of knowledge in medicine, how do we follow um, and acquire knowledge within medicine, we have several schools of thought, and summarized in this slide are the commonest schools of thought that are in use today. For instance, when you look at the traditional method, which this includes Ayurveda, Chinese medicine, and most ancient treatment methods, which are all basically, in a sense, traditional systems that have developed as a result of basic theories on how the body functions. And the essence is this is how it's always been done. We have a standard set of approaches that we use, and they are very, very useful when you're dealing with symptomatic treatment. So, you have this particular condition. If you have a vata dosha or you have a pitta dosha, then this is what you take. This is how you treat such a person. So all of this, traditional methodology is basically well tried and true over decades, if not centuries, and there is a good time and track record of anticipation of results, which is definitely useful when we're treating certain symptoms. But the problem and the huge disadvantage it has is that it's very difficult to apply for people who are not within the system. So if you come to me with a list of Chinese herbs that I have to then integrate into my treatment, it's very difficult because the way a Western trained practitioner or somebody who has not been trained in Chinese medicine can interpret the system is very limited. So that's the traditional thing versus something empirical where, there is knowledge that has also been there for a long time and it comes with practice. What falls in this space is generally homeopathy, where there is a tendency to personalize care. Each person is given a remedy based on their specific evaluation by their homeopathic practitioner, for instance. And the main reason that this is, as has not gained as much populace within the Western world or within Western physician training is the fact that there is actually very little clear treatment guidelines. It's a very empirical method that is validated as a result of the fact that the practitioner has had use, and therefore they are aware based on their practice how to actually use this medication. Now we enter into the rational mode of thinking, which is basically where most Western medicine falls. So just about every medication that you've used falls into this school of thinking, where the advantage is it is objective, it's very dispassionate, it's scientific, reproducible, and the knowledge is transmissible. They tend to disregard every other approach when they see the patient. And most of your doctors, I'm sure, and if you are physicians yourself, you're well aware of this. Yeah, believe heavily in the fact that scientific proof does not exist with other forms of practice. Therefore, this is right because I have proven all other ways that it's not. And therefore, there is actually well-established mainstream sharing methodology, be it peer-reviewed articles or in publications in scientific journals and discussion with colleagues that allows for Western medicine to have a rational approach to different diseases. The biggest disadvantage is that in so practicing Western medicine, we often disregard every other approach. Now, you cannot rule out the role of intuition, which is actually a form of knowledge that is much, much more than any one of these. And it is a part of each one of these as well, where you actually start to grasp the whole patient and the whole picture. And the essence of it is not determined necessarily in the fact that I can prove it, but you know it because you have actually started to spend enough time and have acquired the wisdom that comes with the knowledge of practice. And that is, where you start to begin to treat the patient as a whole. And finally, the most ideal situation would be a synthetic approach, which uses all the above four approaches and uses all the best elements and all the ways of knowing in treatment. And this approach obviously requires reflection, some level of intellectual flexibility, where I'm willing to entertain other options, something that we don't see in Western medicine. And it is actually, in a sense, right, because I have actually intuited, I have also rationally evaluated, I've also empirically observed when I've tested, and then I've established its relationship to tradition. So bottom line is that the best use is actually in all cases. So the point I'm trying to make here is that you want, at the end of the day, as a practitioner, to use something that uses the best of all worlds. And my current practice, which is based on the theory of endobiogeny, is actually synthetic in its use. So I use all available forms of treatment, be it Western, be it Eastern, be it any other. So if you going further into, again, drawing a comparison, you have to understand that to a large extent, medicine evolved initially in the early 20th century through a process of naive reductionism. We started to focus exclusively on cell biology. A lot of the treatments that most of you are even still taking today are actually drugs that were developed to target a single intracellular target, whatever that may be, whether it's an anti-inflammatory like aspirin or Advil, or an aromatase inhibitor that specifically limits one enzyme in the cell that is often used in breast cancer, or diuretics or beta agonists, which are a class of medications that are often used for hypertension or heart disease. So these are all, or for that matter, any replacement therapies for deficient physiological products like hormones and therapies of all kinds. So this was the approach from the 20th century, where people were using medications essentially to substitute for any deficient production, or to try and stop or to try and stimulate within the cell at the cellular level certain mechanisms. By the mid-20th century, we started to evolve into a more complex reductionistic approach, where now, through the explosion of molecular biology and the intense study and the role of DNA, we started to move further and further into the lowest level of activity. In other words, we're going further into the cell, and that resulted in a whole explosion of new fields that I don't expect any of you may have heard of, but clearly they arise from such studies. So we're now into transcriptomics, proteomics, metabolomics. I mean, these names get fancier by the day. And in effect, what we're doing is going deeper and deeper into the cell. No longer are we just inhibiting one product within the cell. We're actually studying the genetics of how it's made, how it's moved, and then we're developing molecules now that are actually stopping that and or interfering with cellular function at a very microscopic level. So all of this has required further analysis of DNA and genetic mechanisms of what we call the transcription or production of proteins within the cell. All of that results in a gene-centered approach, in short, to disease management. The problem is it has failed to work as expected. This is naturally because of what I'm going to present going forward. But in general, the point is that Western medicine has become more and more specialized, and the newer therapies that are emerging have very, very selective targets within the cell. And instead of going the other way, where they start to see the patient more as a whole and look at the person as an integral part of where the disease is happening, we are starting to become more and more microscopic. However, the data that is emerging on treatments is not supporting this kind of an approach, largely because rather than solving problems, we are actually creating more, and we're realizing that there are more patients we are unable to serve successfully. Although we have had rapid advances in management of, let's say, cancers for that matter, because of the genetics, we have now identified, I think, several, if not tens, at least hundreds of genes in different diseases that overlap between diseases. And even if you take the same two patients with the same, let's say, cancer, like breast cancer, with the same genetics and use the same drug, we rarely get the same results. So there is becoming less and less, uniformity, and our attempt to standardize protocols, use algorithms to actually go through a decision tree and choose treatment for patients is not serving everybody, as it is expected that it wouldn't, largely because we are much more than just our cells. So that's what I hope to present in the ongoing slides. So when you start to look at how can I help the patient, which is kind of what has been my personal experience in my own journey, you stumble upon the fact that you may have to integrate different methodologies and actually see the patient as much more complex than one system that I'm going to fix with the cell, with the product, or treatment of the disease itself. So when you shift the emphasis to treatment of the patient rather than just the disease, you start to fall into the realm of integrative medicine. And here I introduce another word where I'm comparing integrative versus integrating medicine, with both of which have subtle differences. So when you look at integrative medicine, what we're trying to do is basically use and layer over current approaches, additional therapies particularly where we don't have satisfactory pharmacological therapies or surgical interventions. And in general, it includes 3 different approaches that most integrative practitioners take. So you will see, for instance, in the realm of integrative medicine, comparators between alternative or complementary approaches versus standard medicine in terms of quality of life and patient well-being. So this is a very common, both the word alternative medicine, complementary medicine has been used to describe most of the traditional therapies that are out there, whether it's Chinese medicine or Ayurveda or homeopathy. Any of these approaches are now starting to get incorporated. And this has to do with the fact that small studies and larger studies now are being shown to have benefit that using some of these treatments is improving our quality of life and patient well-being. And in addition, another favorite is to investigate the mind-body approaches such as meditation or energy therapies. And these are generally mechanisms that these are therapies that we know work, but we don't understand how. So they lack clear mechanisms of action, but they do have proven clinical results. And most importantly, in the whole concept of integrative medicine, the aim is not to encroach upon the dominion of standard clinical medicine. Most people who practice integrative medicine, most of the so-called experts in the field of integrative medicine, they are using it as a supplemental approach, but not to rock the boat of standard clinical medicine. So a lot of integrative medicine focuses on how to supplement and how to layer over the current approaches rather than actually propose anything significantly newer or different. And they do focus on diet and nutritional supplementation. So, for instance, a standard integrative practice would be to use probiotics, or to use fish oil, or to use red yeast rice instead of a statin, or to teach you how to meditate, or the benefits of a mind-body approach. This is very different from integrating medicine, where you actually use a synthetic approach to actually understand the patient, and you're starting to step outside the boundaries of standard clinical medicine. So endobiology is the word here that I wanted to talk a little bit about. I'll just spend a minute or two. This, to go into details on how endobiology works is beyond the scope of this talk. And it's actually very, very difficult even for doctors to understand, but I will try and give it a go here because it's a very right-brained approach. In endobiology, we're using a systems-based approach, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what a systems-based approach looks like. So what we are using is a systems-based approach to medicine, and we are trying to integrate and interrelate different physiological phenomena. Physiology is basically the basic functioning of your cell and of you, how your body works in health and how it works in disease. And we're using that as well as interrelated physiological phenomena to explain what we call a complex and dynamic system, such as a human being. Because you as a human are such a complex and dynamic system. How did you come into existence? How did you develop? And what happened, as you progress from infancy to adulthood? How do you adapt to various demands within your body? And how does your body manage itself against internal and external aggression? We're very, very interested in all of these factors. And by doing this, we develop a very good understanding of the patient. And at this point, the physician is free to use whatever therapy he or she desires based on the precise understanding of the patient. So we end up actually studying the physiology of the patient, both from a endocrine, which we call a humoral, and nervous system, which is a neurohumoral form of regulation. And then what we end up doing is using whatever treatment. So we are truly synthetic in that at sometimes I may use Western medication, at sometimes I may use herbs, at sometimes I may use mind-body techniques, or I may use various combinations of all of the above based on your presentation to design a treatment plan that is unique to you, rather than fit you into an algorithm and say, what disease do you have? So the questions we ask are somewhat different. And as I explained, I will try to go over a systems-based approach, which will maybe highlight that for you in the next page. We believe in endobiology that every disorder, be it physiological, physical, mental, or emotional, directly or indirectly implicates a certain level of endocrine dysfunction. And all of this is scientifically proven. There is data based on decades of research looking at the form of the physiology of the body. And so it is well documented and scientific, but at the same time synthetic, which is what true integrating medicine should be versus the current concept of integrative medicine. So in order for this, you have to understand a little bit about systems theory. I don't know how many of you have heard of Fritjof Capra, but I would highly encourage you to read some of his books. The Tao of Physics is a very big one. And then the Turning Point is the next one that he's written. And what we do in systems theory is very similar to the difference between the classic Newtonian physics and quantum physics, where initially in Newtonian physics, everything was a cause was believed to have an effect. And basically everything was felt to be interconnected in a linear manner. In other words, there is gene X that then codes for protein Y that then causes disease Z. Therefore, gene X is responsible for disease Z. This is kind of the model that, the genetic approach that modern medicine has tried to take, has taken us to places. So if you're hearing about a gene for pancreatic cancer, or a gene for breast cancer, or a gene for Parkinson's, or, potential gene for Alzheimer's and the need for genetic therapy, they are all based on a linear interrelative pattern, which is very different from the way the quantum physics model works or a systems theory work. But within the systems theory, what we're really looking at in an open system model is we're looking at the environment. We're interested in the interrelatedness and interdependence of all phenomena. We don't ignore anything happening. We look at everything, we give it equal weight, And in this framework, an integrated whole whose properties cannot be reduced to those of its part is called a system, which means that if, if I look at you as a human being and you are a series of systems that work together, you are much more than all the systems put together. So if you look at myself, putting my heart, my lungs, my kidneys, my skin, and my gut together in another person would not create me. I, as the whole, my properties cannot be reduced to those of my parts. I am larger than the whole. So the basic open system model as shown in this means that you have to take into factor the environment, all the elements that are outside the system that have the potential to affect all or part of the system. You also need to recognize that there are resources that are taken or received from this environment, and that the open system model means that the whole or this particular system within the body, as a result of taking these resources, we have, through process of conversion or transformation, usage of resources within the system that generates an output. And then this output feeds back into the system. So in other words, it's a dynamic approach where I'm looking at where I am, who I am, and how I interrelate with my environment to understand why disease is being caused in me. So this is the systems theory on which endobiogeny is based. And here I'm going to talk a little bit about what science, people who have pioneered some of these approaches, although not necessarily endobiogeny, certain concepts that I hope you will follow. First of all, I wanted to highlight this particular book, The Biology of Belief. I don't know how many of you have ever read it or heard of the author. Bruce Lipton is a cell biologist who came up, and this book was published, I want to say, in 2009, 2007, 2008, in that period, where there was an explosion in the fact that we are looking at the whole thing backwards. So, for instance, as a cell biologist, his basic contribution was that it was really the relationship between the cell and its environment that was controlled by the cell membrane that regulated function, not the genes. And as he says in his book, you are actually not just yourself, you're a bustling community of more than 50 trillion cells that all work together. And I often tell my patients, the analogy is very similar to when you go listen to a symphony. If you've been to a symphony, you see a couple of hundred musicians on the stage, and they all play in perfect harmony. And the reason they play in perfect harmony is because they are all reading the same piece of music. And if each of them had a different music sheet and one was playing one sonata and the other one was playing another one, then it would not sound like a symphony at all. But they all read the same music, and they all chime in when they have to, and then they go quiet when they have to, allowing the other to play. This is exactly what your body is doing. So in this particular slide, what you see is a picture of the cell with its components, typical human cell, with its individual components, which we call organelles. These little organelles, this is, for instance, the endoplasmic reticulum. This is the nucleus of the cell. That was the Golgi body. This is the endoplasmic reticulum. These are all individual components that we study when we start studying cell biology as individual little organelles or mini organs within the cell. And the likeliness of this individual cell is very similar to the human body, where each of these organelles are like your own organ systems. For instance, the nucleus is very similar to the brain. The endoplasmic reticulum, where the proteins are synthesized, is very similar to the liver. The Golgi body, where there is actually final processing of these proteins, is another part of the body. And the mitochondria, which you see here, which are the areas where the energy is produced, are very similar to the lungs. So the parallels between the fact that each cell is a system which is closed to itself, but then it lives in a community of several cells that then form an organ, and each organ then within the person is part of a system, a whole system of you being the human being, was a concept that we started to integrate into holistic medicine. And in this book, what he talks a lot about is that actually for centuries, everybody believed that the genes which are stored in the nucleus were the center of where everything happened, that the genes determined who you were going to become. And so genetics was part of your destiny. But as he was able to show, and after him, several other people were able to also demonstrate this phenomenon, we realize that genes are actually downstream to the determinants. In other words, what really creates the intelligence of this particular cell system and how the cell functions is not necessarily what is stored in the nucleus, but the functioning of the cell membrane. The actual membrane of the cell, which is the outer covering of the cell, has the intelligence through its various channels and proteins that are within it that allow or not allow things inside to actually interpret its environment or what it's bathed in. And therefore, that allows this cell to have the intelligence to tell itself what genes have to be transcribed. So that's what I've written here before. The cell with its organelles or mini organs at the microscopic level is similar to the body with its multiple organ systems that work together. The cell membrane with its receptor proteins is the manager of this at the microscopic level, while at the macroscopic level, the global system, which is your entire body's functioning, is like a cell membrane that manages the genes and not vice versa. So it's not like you are a victim to the genes you carry. It is that you, through your perception of your environment, actually tell your genes what to make and what not to make. The control level is not in the nucleus or the genetics. The control is in the relationship to the environment. This has been well proven because I don't know if you recall when the Human Genome Project was launched, I think in the late 1990s, there was a lot of anticipation and a race to the finish line of who can clone the human genome first. And that was a big item. There was a lot of hoopla. There was a lot of excitement that we have basically now, what's the word for it, figured out a way to solve all problems related to human disease. And in the scientific community, there was all this excitement. But all that big pizzazz died down very, very quickly when we finished transcribing the genetic code. And today we're not that much wiser than we were before we knew it. And that's when people started to realize that it was never the genes, it is the relationship between the cell and its environment, or epigenetics, which was the new field that was then born, where we had to understand better the relationship between the environment and the genes rather than just the genes itself. So today, we well recognize the epigenetic model of disease where we never ever attribute anything just to the genes, but to actually the relationship between the environment and the individual. So epigenetics has continued to evolve, and it determines that there are internal and external determinants on the expression of genes. So this particular slide, I'm not sure whether you can read it. So I am going to read it out for you just because it makes a very important point. So if you had to summarize epigenetics, it really is, we are not controlled by genes like computer programs are controlled by code. This is a fallacy propagated by Darwinian-based scientism for almost 2 centuries. Genes are a biological tendency for expression. In other words, genes give you the potential for expression, but not the probability for disease. Changing our state of consciousness can influence or even change completely the tendency for expression. When we do this, our code can actually be rewritten and a different manifestation can be expressed. So in summary, we are not the code, we are writers of the code. And this is the theory behind which I'm sure a lot of your other speakers were talking to you about, whether you eat a certain way or cook a certain way, or you exercise this much, or you spend time meditating, or you de-stress. It definitely affects your longevity, your health, your well-being, how your physical body functions. That's the classic implication of epigenetics, which is that, you may have been born into a family where everybody developed diabetes at the age of 50, but it doesn't mean you need to. You will if you follow the same choices they made. But if you choose differently, as simple as diet and lifestyle, you might delay or even stop the development of a chronic illness like diabetes by your choices if you started earlier. So that is a classic application of epigenetics. So going on to how somebody who uses the system theory would actually look at disease, this is a basic summary slide where I'm looking at some of the components I already talked to you about. So on your left is the various components within the cell. So here is a cell, and here is the nucleus of the cell, and within the nucleus is the chromosome, And within the chromosome is the actual DNA, which is called your blueprint or fingerprint, which connects the genetic code, which has the genetic code that defines, the color of your hair, the color of your eyes, what height you're going to be, and so on. Different components of your phenotype or your physical manifestations. So when you actually look at how we approach a patient in a system model of disease, we start to separate from how the disease develops. This is where medicine falls. Most of your standard medical literature as well as treatments fall in this realm, where there is interest in what is happening at the nucleus, what is happening at the level of the DNA, what's happening at the level of the genes. This will tell you how the disease develops. But when you look at it holistically, this is not enough for the average integrating medicine practitioner. We are also interested in why the disease develops in this individual at this time. In other words, why do you have this disease? Why did it happen at this time is a bigger question. And for that, we need to have a global systems medicine model, where if this is your system, where you have different organ systems working together, each one affects the function of other, you have an input into this system where something happens in the environment around you that then creates within the body or the organ systems a response. And that response leads to the release of some information that can then result in cellular transformation and the transcription or the genetic expression of certain factors that then can cause the disease. So this is what we look at, and this is what we evaluate in endobiology for every patient. So I'm not really just interested in what disease you have. I'm interested in why you have the disease, how you developed it, how also, therefore, can you reverse it? That's the goal that I wanted to focus on. So this is just basically showing you the interrelatedness of it all. That when we take both the cell, we take all the organ systems, the different layers of the cellular of your development, which then generates your body, and we look at all internal and external factors that interfere through the environment with the functioning of you as a whole, you as a bunch of organ systems, and you at the cellular level. The other concept I just wanted to mention here is that all of this kind of connectedness or interconnectedness requires a manager. There has to be something within your body that actually regulates the functioning of all of this. And in endobiology, as I alluded to earlier, we use the hormonal system as the actual manager of the terrain. We're interested in what is happening at the hormone level, different hormones, and we study hormonal activity, not just levels in the blood, but we study between how hormone levels are working within the cell and how different hormone systems are talking to each other. And if you look at what regulates hormonal activity, this is basically a slide alluding to, again, work from a very seminary paper, as well as a Nobel Prize shortlist scientist. Her name is Candace Pert. And this is a book that I would also suggest very much that you consider reading. It's called Molecules of Emotion. And she talks of it as the science behind mind-body medicine and alludes to the power of emotions. So to quote her, what she realized in her lab is that the molecules of emotion, in other words, feeling or relating to the environment, which we do all the time, is through emotion. And when you actually feel an emotion within your body, what happens is there is the release of certain molecules, which are a kind of neuropeptide, which is basically a protein that will affect every cell in your body. The chemistry and electricity of every cell in your body and mind is affected through these molecules. And this is how you experience at the cellular level whatever the emotion is that was caused by the environment around you, by your interaction with the environment around you. So feelings literally alter the electrical frequencies that are generated by our bodies, producing a non-verbal communication. She was able to show this very eloquently in her research. And she said as well that the prefrontal cortex, which is actually the only part of our body that actually is different from other animals. The prefrontal cortex is our ability to, that's what gives us our sense of self. That's what gives us our sense of identity. That's the one that actually, makes us who we are as far as our ability to be rational, thinking, and analyzing beings. She says that the prefrontal cortex is responsible for complex evaluative decisions. This part of the brain is loaded with opioid receptors. So structurally, our most sophisticated reasoning is linked to bliss. So she shows very eloquently in this particular article that some of these neuropeptides that are released as a result of our experience are opioids, in what they call endogenous opioids. They belong to a class of chemicals that are very similar to morphine and to other medications that we use that for pain treatment. So these are basically now known as endorphins, these endogenous opioids. So her research is on endorphin molecules, and she realized that these endorphin receptors are most prominent within the prefrontal cortex, and therefore a lot of what we do and how we process our environment and use it to learn is basically in effect related to our desire for bliss, which is basically what we are all here for. So you start to connect or create a link between how we experience the environment and what drives us to do things one way or the other. Most of us are making choices unconsciously, albeit, or semi-consciously, in order to experience more of this bliss. So she does say, as our feelings change, this mixture of peptides that travels throughout your body and your brain also changes, and they are literally changing the chemistry of every cell of your body. So she starts to connect these neuropeptides to the emotions, and this work was very seminal to what I'm going to say next, which is that emotions actually do rule. So emotions are electrochemical signals that affect the chemistry and electricity within every cell in the body. So human beings are like tuning forks, and they're in constant vibration, broadcasting and receiving information from the energy within. So how you perceive your environment, what and how you experience life has a lot to do with how your body and your cells, the intelligence that bathes your body and your cells. It is like the sheet of music I talked about that every musician on stage in the symphony reads. Each of your cell is being bathed with the intelligence that is generated as a result of your perception of the environment. And the hormones are just there to transfer. So peptides such as hormones of the pituitary and peptide receptors, they help modulate the expression of these emotions. In other words, you experience something and your experience defines the language of the hormone activity, which is then transmitted to your cells. And your cells are then functioning in a certain manner based on whether your experience is positive or negative. And why is this important? This is important because it actually starts to show you how you can create or uncreate disease. So to a large extent, this work, and what I have on the left-hand side here is the picture of the pituitary, the hypothalamo-pituitary axis, which is really the maternal and the paternal influences on our body through this release of different hormones, which are the area of study that we have in endobiogeny. We work on all of this in endobiogeny. So in effect, what you have to realize is that my emotions create my pain. So behind every disease, and this is where it's going to be difficult for you to grasp, and I do not have the time to go into it in great detail, but I wanted to at least tickle your imagination here to understand that the real you is not your physical body, although almost all treatments are geared towards your physical body. The real you is the soul behind you. This is the part of your body that this is actually the real you that has and is the seat of your emotions, your passions, your desires, your aspirations, your intentions, your longings, your memories, and your personality, which is unique to you, and your choices as determined by the fact that you have free will. All of this you experiences life through the two appendages, which is your physical body and your spirit body. This is what you use when you go to sleep at night. This is what you use during the day when you're awake. The brain and the physical body is a mere tool to help regulate the functioning of the physical body, but it is not where you store your memories. Memories are actually stored in your mind and in the soul. This is why people who can have a piece of their brain removed can still remember events, because that's not where things are stored at all. Things are stored in these levels. Why is this important? The health of your physical body requires for you to be connected to your soul, because it is your soul that feeds the energy. This is one of the reasons why most children are born healthy. And most diseases evolve as we get older. Because as we get older and become more and more mind-centered and intellect-centered, we end up actually disconnecting from the seat of our real self. The language of the soul is emotions, passions, and desires. And when you allow these to flow through you, that's when your body stays healthy. So behind every disease is suppressed emotion. Physical pain occurs because of my denial of emotional pain. Most of us are not aware of this. And we may be aware in some ways because now there is enough evidence to say there is stress and you have to mitigate stress, and stress makes the disease worse. But few people go the extra mile to tell you actually that your stress causes disease. Therefore, uncausing disease, which is a corollary, could also be possible if I changed myself. And therefore, I put forth for you that physical pain occurs because you deny emotional pain. And when you suppress emotion, which is supposed to flow through your soul, you are creating little energy pockets that stay stuck in your soul that then interfere with the energy flow into your bodies. And actually, over a period of time, that is what evolves into generating disease. So these suppressed emotions in turn alter our perception of our environment and can cause disease through alteration in the body and cellular physiology through their effects on the hormone systems that I have discussed for you so far. This is actually the true cause of all disease. Any other approach we take in treatment only works on effects and thus is only of temporary benefit. So this is something for you to think about. And so when I put it all together, here is you. You are both sensing and sending out signals into the world, and the external environment in which you are, which you experience through every cell in your body, but especially heightened through your senses, the 5 special senses of sight, touch, sound, taste, smell. All of these generate emotions within you. And that interaction can result in a series of different emotions. And I've just highlighted some of the more common ones. And when you actually experience them and there is this feeling, whether you allow these feelings to flow or not, creates, as you get older, certain choices that you make with respect to expression of these as you get older, that then creates within you a loss of emotional amplitude. Most adults are far less capable of experiencing emotions than their childhood counterparts. If you compare a young child to the average grandparent, the child is much, much more able, as we all were at the beginning of life, to experience the peaks and the valleys of their emotional response, which has become greatly dampened as we get towards our older years. So as your age in years increases, it appears that your emotional bandwidth starts to shrink. And this shrinking is associated with an increasing intellect. So we become more heavily invested in our intellect, less heavily invested in our actual experiencing things, which therefore results in us developing eventually a state of numbness. And this state of numbness to varying degrees is what creates most disease. So we sacrifice health and vitality as a result of this. And unfortunately, fortunately rather, waiting for us on the other side is the state of union with the divine, which is bliss. But you will have to break down this numbness and go back further into more of your the emotional real you, in order to be able to experience this bliss. So I want to conclude by saying there is nothing new in the tendency to take obvious things for granted and to postpone logical thought. For many centuries, we were satisfied to accept life itself without questioning and without inquiring as to its beginnings, variations, and potentialities. Now we have some desire for understanding how life began, of its continuation and limitations. And I'm hoping I was able to stimulate within you at least some questions of what can I do in this scenario and how can this information help me. Thank you for your time.